the rain wasn't just falling that Tuesday afternoon, it was punishing the earth. It came down in sheets of gray steel, hammering against the asphalt of the old county road, turning the dirt paths into treacherous veins of mud and slick gravel. For most people in the sleepy town of Oakhaven, this was weather to hide from. It was a day to lock the doors, draw the curtains tight against the gloom, and sit by the fire with a warm cup of tea. But for 85-year-old Arthur Pendleton, the storm meant absolutely nothing. In fact, the biting cold that seeped through the wool of his coat felt appropriate. It matched the freezing void that had lived inside his chest for exactly 2,555 days. Arthur stood in the entryway of his small, silent house, his trembling hand hovering over the brass handle of the door. His knuckles were swollen, knotted with the arthritis that had plagued him for a decade, a constant throbbing reminder of a body that was slowly betraying him. His doctor, a young man named Dr. Evans, who spoke too fast and looked at computer screens more than patients, had been clear just yesterday. "Arthur," he had said, his voice tinged with that condescending patience people reserve for the elderly, "your heart is operating at 30% capacity. You cannot keep walking up that hill in this weather. You are risking a cardiac event every single time you step out that door. You need rest. You need to stay warm." Arthur had nodded politely, taken the prescription slips he had no intention of filling, and walked out. Rest? What use was rest when the other half of his soul was 6 feet under the cold ground? Staying warm? There was no warmth left in this world, not since Mary's hand had slipped from his grasp in that sterile hospital room 7 years ago. He pushed the door open. The wind hit him like a physical blow, staggering him backward for a second. It screamed through the porch railings, a high-pitched wail that sounded like a warning. Arthur tightened his grip on his cane, a sturdy piece of polished oak that had once belonged to his father, and stepped out into the deluge. Pain shot up his left leg, a sharp electric jolt from his hip to his ankle, but he grit his teeth and forced his left foot forward. Then the right, then the left again. It was a rhythm of agony and determination. 1 step for duty, 1 step for love. The cemetery was located on a ridge overlooking the town, a 3-mile walk that felt like a marathon for a man of his age and condition. Every breath was a struggle. The icy air burned his lungs, and his heart fluttered wildly in his chest, a bird trapped in a cage of brittle bone. Thump, flutter, thump. He knew the doctor was right. He knew he was dying. Some days he hoped the end would come right there on the road. It would be easier. But not today. He couldn't die today. It was their anniversary. By the time the iron gates of the cemetery loomed out of the fog, Arthur was soaked to the bone. His gray coat, heavy with water, dragged on his shoulders like a lead vest. His vision was blurred, rain dripping from his eyebrows, stinging his eyes. The cemetery was empty, abandoned by the living. The tombstones rose from the mist like jagged teeth, silent and judging. The silence here was heavy, thicker than the storm. It was the silence of forgotten things. Arthur navigated the path by memory alone. He didn't need to see to know where she was. He knew every crack in the pavement, every tree root that had broken through the earth. He walked toward the old willow tree at the far north corner, the spot Mary had chosen herself 40 years ago because she liked the way the morning sun hit the grass. As he rounded the final bend, his heart gave a strange, violent lurch. At first, his brain couldn't process what his eyes were seeing. The fog was playing tricks on him, he thought. It had to be the exhaustion. It had to be the lack of oxygen reaching his tired brain. Because there, lying directly on top of Mary's grave, was a shadow. But shadows don't breathe. Shadows don't have mass. This shape was enormous. It was a mountain of dark fur, rising and falling with a slow, rhythmic power. Arthur stopped dead in his tracks, his cane sinking into the mud. He wiped the rain from his eyes with a shaking hand, blinking rapidly. Maybe it was a bear? The town had reports of black bears coming down from the mountains, rummaging through trash cans. But bears didn't lie on graves.
Bears didn't have that tawny, golden hue that seemed to glow even in the darkness of the storm. The creature shifted. A massive head, heavy and regal, lifted from the cold stone marker. Arthur gasped, the sound sucked away by the wind. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a stray dog. It was a lion, a full-grown, male African lion with a mane that looked like a storm cloud of black and gold. The absurdity of it made him dizzy. A lion? Here, in the middle of a Pennsylvania winter? It was impossible. It was a hallucination. He was finally having that stroke the doctor warned him about. That was it. He was dying and his mind was conjuring monsters to usher him into the next life. But then the beast turned its head. The movement was fluid, terrifyingly graceful. Two eyes, the color of burning amber, locked on Arthur. There was no glass between them, no zoo bars, no safety. Just 30 feet of wet grass and a predator that could crush a human skull with a single swipe of its paw.
Arthur's survival instinct screamed at him to run. His legs wanted to buckle, to turn, to flee. But he was frozen, rooted to the spot not by fear, but by a sudden, overwhelming sense of awe. The lion stared at him. It didn't bare its fangs. It didn't crouch into an attack position. It simply watched him with an intensity that felt almost human. Rainwater ran down the lion's scarred nose. Its fur was matted and soaked, clinging to a muscular frame that spoke of immense, lethal power. But there was something else in that posture, something that Arthur recognized from his own reflection in the mirror every morning. The lion looked exhausted. It looked broken. The beast let out a sound, not a roar, but a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the ground and traveled up through the soles of Arthur's boots. It was a sound of deep, resonating sorrow. Arthur stood alone in the storm, an old man with a failing heart facing a beast from a different world. And in that impossible silence, broken only by the thunder rolling overhead, Arthur Pendleton did the one thing that no sane person would ever do. He took a step forward. The mud sucked at Arthur's boots with every tentative step, making a squelching sound that seemed deafening in the standoff. He was moving against every law of nature, against every instinct of self-preservation that had kept his ancestors alive for thousands of years. His brain was screaming at him, "Turn around, run, it's a killing machine." But his feet, guided by a grief deeper than any ocean, kept moving forward. 20 feet. The lion didn't flinch. It remained draped over the marble headstone like a sphinx, its massive paws crossed in front of it. The rain plastered its golden mane to its neck, revealing the sheer density of the muscles underneath. It was a creature built for violence, designed by evolution to tear through bone and flesh without hesitation. Yet, as Arthur closed the distance, he noticed something that made his breath catch in his throat. The lion wasn't tracking him like prey. It wasn't tensing its haunches to spring. Its eyes, heavy-lidded and rimmed with an ancient weariness, were simply watching him, waiting. 10 feet. The smell hit Arthur now, a thick, pungent scent of wet musk, wild earth, and raw power. It was an alien smell in this manicured garden of the dead, a scent that belonged on the savannas of Africa, not in a small-town cemetery in Pennsylvania. The air around the beast felt charged, heavier, as if the lion generated its own gravity. Arthur's heart was hammering against his ribs so hard he felt dizzy, black spots dancing in his vision. His pacemaker, installed 5 years ago, felt like a toy trying to keep up with the surge of adrenaline flooding his fragile system. 5 feet. Arthur stopped. He was close enough now to see the scars on the lion's face, 3 jagged lines running down its muzzle, old battle wounds from a life of struggle. He was close enough to see the individual whiskers, thick as wire, twitching with the raindrops. He was close enough to die in less than a second. The silence stretched, agonizing and absolute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The lion lifted its head slowly. The movement was majestic, terrifying. It opened its mouth, exposing canines the size of butcher knives, yellowed and sharp. Arthur gripped his cane, his knuckles turning white.
This was it. This was the end. But the lion didn't roar. It didn't bite. It let out a soft, huffing exhale, a sound that was almost a sigh. A cloud of steam rose from its nostrils and dissipated in the rain. Arthur looked down at the grave beneath the beast. The name Mary Pendleton was partially obscured by the lion's massive chest. A sudden, irrational thought bloomed in Arthur's mind, a thought born of loneliness and desperation. She sent him. "You're protecting her," Arthur whispered. His voice was cracked, brittle like dry leaves. "Aren't you?" The lion blinked, slow, deliberate, a gesture of acknowledgement. Arthur's trembling hand released the grip on his cane. He reached out. His skin was pale, paper-thin, spotted with age. His hand shook violently as it moved through the cold, wet air toward the massive head of the predator. It was the longest reach of his life. Inches felt like miles. If the lion snapped, Arthur would lose his arm. If it lunged, he would lose his life. But he didn't pull back. He let his fingers brush against the coarse, wet fur between the lion's ears. The texture was rough, oily, and shockingly warm. The heat radiating from the animal was immense, a furnace of life in the freezing storm. Arthur gasped. The contact sent a jolt of electricity through his body that seemed to restart his tired heart. And then the impossible happened, the moment that would defy logic and science. The lion didn't pull away. It didn't growl. Instead, the great beast leaned into Arthur's hand. It pushed its massive head up against the old man's palm, seeking the pressure, seeking the touch. It closed its amber eyes and let out a low, rumbling kurr that vibrated through Arthur's arm and settled deep in his chest.
It was a sound of comfort, a sound of shared sorrow. Tears, hot and fast, mixed with the rain on Arthur's cheeks. The fear evaporated, replaced by a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly knocked him over. He wasn't alone. For 7 years he had stood at this grave talking to cold stone in silence. But now there was warmth. There was a living, breathing presence that seemed to understand the crushing weight of his grief. "Who are you?" Arthur wept, scratching behind the lion's ear, his fingers burying themselves in the thick, wet mane. "Where did you come from?" The lion offered no answers, only its presence. It shifted slightly, making room on the small patch of dry ground beneath the shelter of the willow branches that hung over the grave. It was an invitation. Arthur, his legs finally giving out from the strain, sank to his knees in the mud. He didn't care about the cold. He didn't care about the mud ruining his pants. He collapsed beside the lion, his shoulder pressing against the animal's massive flank. The heat from the beast soaked into him, easing the ache in his joints, quieting the tremors in his hands. For the first time in 7 years, the cold didn't hurt. Man and beast sat there, side by side in the pouring rain, watching over Mary. A fragile old man and a king of the jungle, united by a silent, inexplicable vigil. But the world outside the cemetery gates was not silent. Far down in the valley, sirens began to wail. Blue and red lights flickered against the low-hanging clouds. The town was waking up to the presence of a monster. They were coming with guns. They were coming with fear. Arthur looked at the lion. The lion looked at the road. "Don't worry," Arthur whispered, a newfound steel entering his voice. "I won't let them take you." The peace didn't last. It never does in stories like this. The tranquility of that rainy communion was shattered by the screech of tires on wet asphalt, a sound so harsh it felt like a physical violation of the sacred ground. High-beam headlights cut through the gloom, slicing across the tombstones like blinding white blades. One car, then 2, then 3. The flashing red and blue lights painted the cemetery walls in a chaotic strobe light panic, reflecting off the wet marble and dazzling Arthur's tired eyes. The lion tensed against him. Arthur felt the change instantly. The muscles under the golden fur coiled tight as steel cables. The beast let out a low growl. a rumble that started deep in its chest and escalated into a warning that shook the raindrops from the willow leaves above. It wasn't a sound of fear, it was a sound of challenge. The predator was preparing to defend its territory, and its territory, for reasons Arthur still couldn't comprehend, now included him. "Easy," Arthur whispered, his hand firm on the lion's flank. "Easy, King. Stay with me." A loudspeaker crackled to life, the feedback whining through the storm. "Arthur Pendleton, this is Sheriff Miller. We need you to move away from the animal. I repeat, step away from the animal immediately. We have shooters in position." Shooters. The word hung in the cold air like a death sentence. Arthur squinted through the glare. He could see them now, silhouettes moving tactically behind the open doors of the cruisers, rifles raised, scopes trained. Men he had known since they were boys in Sunday school were now looking at him through the crosshairs of high-powered weapons, ready to put a bullet into the only living thing that had brought him warmth in 7 years. A surge of anger, hot and unfamiliar, flooded Arthur's veins. It burned away the cold. It burned away the arthritis. For the first time in a decade, he didn't feel like an invalid. He felt like a husband defending his wife. He felt like a father defending his child. Using the tombstone for leverage, Arthur forced himself to stand. His knees popped, his back screamed in protest, but he rose. He planted his feet wide in the mud, grabbed his cane, and instead of moving away as ordered, he moved closer. He placed his frail body directly between the police rifles and the lion. "Arthur!" The sheriff's voice boomed again, tinged with panic. "What are you doing? Get out of the way! That thing is a man-eater!" "You put those guns down, Miller!" Arthur screamed. His voice, usually a rasping whisper, now was a roar that rivaled the storm. "You fire a single shot, and you'll have to shoot me first." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. The police officers exchanged glances. This wasn't the scenario they had trained for. They were prepared for a rampaging beast, for blood and gore. They were not prepared for the town's oldest, most fragile widower to use himself as a human shield for an African lion. The lion, sensing the escalation, stood up. It towered over Arthur. Its head came up to Arthur's chest, but instead of charging the lights, the beast did something extraordinary. It nudged Arthur's hand with its wet nose, then turned its body sideways, pressing its flank against Arthur's legs, anchoring him. It was a clear, tactical move. The lion was offering support. It was telling the armed men, "We stand together." Sheriff Miller stepped out from behind his car, his hands raised, signaling his men to hold fire. He walked to the cemetery gate, keeping a safe distance. "Arthur, please," he shouted over the wind, "be reasonable. That is a wild animal. It escaped from a private transport on the highway an hour ago. It's dangerous. It's confused. It could tear you apart in a second." "He's been sitting here for an hour and hasn't touched me," Arthur yelled back, not yielding an inch. "He's not confused, Miller. He's mourning. Look at him. Can't you see? He's grieving just like me." It sounded insane. Arthur knew how it sounded. But as the sheriff looked closer, squinting through the rain, he saw it. The lion wasn't pacing, it wasn't snarling. It was standing perfectly still, its golden eyes locked on the men with a calm, regal intelligence that was unnerving. It didn't look like a monster. It looked like a sentinel. "I can't leave a lion in the middle of town, Arthur," Miller pleaded, desperation creeping into his voice. "We have protocols. Animal control is on the way with tranquilizers. Just step aside." "No tranquilizers," Arthur barked. "You know what those drugs do to a heart under stress? You could kill him. You leave him be. He's not hurting anyone. He's visiting Mary. Let him visit Mary." The standoff lasted for hours. The rain turned to sleet, coating the world in ice. The police kept their perimeter, guns trained but silent. The town gathered behind the police tape, a sea of umbrellas and whispering faces. They watched in disbelief as the old man sat back down on the grave and the lion lay down beside him, resting its heavy head on Arthur's knee. It was a tableau that defied logic, a scene from a fable brought to life in modern America. Eventually, the sheriff realized he couldn't force a resolution without risking a PR nightmare or a tragedy. He couldn't shoot a lion while it was cuddling a pensioner. He ordered his men to lower their weapons but maintain the perimeter. "Fine, Arthur," Miller shouted, defeated. "But if that thing moves 1 inch toward the gate, we drop it. You hear me? 1 inch." "He won't move," Arthur muttered softly, stroking the lion's wet fur. "He's home." And so began the strangest week in the history of Oakhaven. The cemetery became a fortress. The police set up barricades. News vans arrived from the city, their satellite dishes turning the quiet town into a media circus. Headlines flashed across the country: "The Lion and the Widower," "Miracle in the Graveyard," "The Beast Who Mourns." But inside the perimeter, none of that mattered. Inside, there was only Arthur and King. Arthur refused to leave. He knew if he left, they would shoot, so he stayed. He slept sitting up against the tombstone, huddled under a tarp the sheriff allowed him to have. He shared his sandwiches with the lion. He poured water from his thermos into a plastic bowl for the beast. And the lion never left his side, not once. When Arthur slept, the lion stayed awake, its yellow eyes scanning the darkness, guarding the old man's dreams. When Arthur woke, stiff and freezing, the lion would press its warm body against him, a living heater keeping the hypothermia at bay. They developed a language without words. A touch of the paw meant, "I'm here." A low rumble meant danger. A slow blink meant trust. Arthur felt his strength returning. The purpose that had been missing from his life was suddenly burning bright. He wasn't just a sad old man anymore. He was a protector. He was a king's guardian. But biology is cruel, and winter is unrelenting. On the 5th night, the temperature plummeted. The sleet turned to heavy snow. A blizzard, the worst in 20 years, began to bury the cemetery. The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at the tarp Arthur had rigged up. Arthur shivered violently, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. His face was gray, his lips were blue. The adrenaline that had sustained him was fading, replaced by the crushing reality of his 85-year-old physiology. His heart, already weak, began to flutter erratically. Thump, pause, thump. King sensed it immediately. The lion rose from his spot and nudged Arthur hard with his nose. He whined, a high-pitched sound that was entirely unlion-like. He started pacing around Arthur, looking from the old man to the distant lights of the police cars, then back again. I'm okay, boy," Arthur stuttered, his voice barely audible over the wind. But he wasn't. He couldn't feel his fingers. He couldn't feel his toes. A heavy drowsiness was settling over him, a warm, seductive blanket that promised sleep. Arthur knew what that meant. It was the final stage of freezing. Just a little nap," Arthur whispered, his eyes sliding shut. He leaned his head back against Mary's tombstone. "I'll see you soon, Mary." The lion roared. It was a sound of pure terror. It grabbed Arthur's coat sleeve with its teeth and tugged, trying to wake him, but Arthur was too heavy, too far gone. The old man slumped sideways, sliding into the snow. The king looked at the fallen man. Then he looked at the police cars, 200 yards away through the blinding whiteout. The beast made a choice. Abandoning the safety of the grave, abandoning his post, the beast did the unthinkable. He didn't run away. He ran toward the humans. Sheriff Miller was the first to see the movement. Through the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, a massive shape detached itself from the darkness of the cemetery grounds. It wasn't creeping, it wasn't stalking, it was charging. The lion was covering the frozen ground with terrifying speed, its muscles pumping like pistons, kicking up plumes of snow in its wake. It was heading straight for the barricade, straight for the men. "Contact front," Sheriff Miller screamed, his voice cracking with fear. "Target incoming. Safety's off. Prepare to fire."
The sound of 20 rifles clicking off safety echoed like a synchronized mechanical death rattle. Officers dropped to their knees behind car doors, eyes pressed to scopes, fingers taking up the slack on triggers. The red lasers of their sights danced through the snow, searching for the chest of the beast. "Wait for my command," Miller bellowed, though his own hand was shaking on his service pistol. "Wait until he crosses the 30-yard line." The lion kept coming. 50 yards, 40 yards. Through the scopes, the men could see the beast's mouth open. They expected a roar of aggression, the sound of an attack, but what they heard was different. It was a desperate, rhythmic huffing. The lion wasn't looking at them with the predatory focus of a hunter. Its eyes were wide, frantic, darting back toward the darkness where the old man lay dying. 30 yards. "Sir, he's not stopping," Officer Jenkins shouted from the left flank. "I have a clean shot. Permission to engage." Miller's finger tightened on the trigger. This was it. The beast had broken the perimeter. Protocol demanded he put it down to protect his men. He took a breath, aiming for the center of the golden mane. "Take the He never finished the word. At 25 yards, the lion did something that froze every finger on every trigger. He didn't leap. He didn't lunge. He slammed on the brakes, his massive paws skidding on the ice, bringing his 500-pound frame to a violent, clumsy halt. He stood there in the harsh glare of the headlights, completely exposed, an easy target. And then he dropped. The lion lowered his chest to the snow in a play bow, the universal sign of submission or invitation. He let out a roar that wasn't a challenge, but a scream, a deep, resonant cry that sounded eerily like a sob. Then he stood up, turned his back on the armed men, exposing his defenseless spine to their bullets, and ran a few steps back toward the cemetery. He stopped, looked back at the police, and roared again. He wants us to follow him," Miller whispered, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. The sheriff lowered his gun. "He's not attacking. He's leading." "Sir?" Jenkins asked, bewildered. "Stand down," Miller screamed. "Nobody shoots. Get the medic team. Now. He's showing us where Arthur is." Miller jumped over the barricade, sprinting into the storm. "Follow me. Follow the lion." The beast saw the men moving and immediately turned, bounding back into the dark, guiding them through the maze of headstones. He didn't run too fast. He kept checking over his shoulder to make sure the slow, clumsy humans were keeping up. He led them straight to the willow tree, to the snow-covered mound where Arthur Pendleton lay silent and still. When Miller arrived, breathless and freezing, the scene broke his heart. Arthur was blue. His skin was waxy, his eyes closed, his breathing undetectable. The lion stood over the body, licking the old man's face frantically with his rough tongue, trying to stimulate blood flow, trying to wake his friend. "Get him out of here," Miller yelled to the paramedics who were sliding in the mud behind him. "Code Blue, move, move, move." The paramedics swarmed the body. They pushed the lion aside, a risky move that could have cost them their hands, but the beast stepped back willingly. He sat in the snow, watching with intense, intelligent eyes as they cut open Arthur's coat, applied the defibrillator pads, and began CPR. 1, 2, 3, breathe. The lion let out a low whine. 1, 2, 3, breathe. "No pulse," the medic shouted. "He's hypothermic. Core temp is critical. We need to get him to the truck, now." They loaded Arthur onto the stretcher. As they lifted him, Sheriff Miller looked at the lion. The beast was shivering now, the cold finally penetrating his thick coat. He looked at the sheriff, and for a fleeting second, Miller felt a profound sense of shame. He had almost killed the only creature that had tried to save Arthur. "You're a good boy," Miller whispered to the predator. "You did good." The lion watched as they loaded Arthur into the back of the ambulance. The doors slammed shut. The engine roared. The sirens began to wail as the vehicle sped into the distance toward the county hospital. The lion stood alone in the empty cemetery. The police officers retreated, unsure what to do with the animal now that the human shield was gone. Miller was on the radio, calling animal control, calling the zoo, trying to find a peaceful solution. But when he turned back to check on the beast, the spot under the willow tree was empty. There were paw prints in the snow leading away from the grave, heading towards the dense forest that bordered the mountains. But they were strange tracks. They didn't look heavy. They looked fading. As Miller watched, the fresh falling snow filled them in, erasing the evidence that the king had ever been there at all. The steady, rhythmic beeping of the cardiac monitor was the first thing Arthur heard. It was an annoying sound, sharp and insistent, pulling him up from the deep, dark ocean of unconsciousness. He felt heavy. His body felt like it was made of lead, but beneath the weight, there was warmth. So much warmth. He cracked his eyes open. The light was blinding. White ceiling tiles, white walls, the smell of antiseptic. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry as sandpaper. He managed to croak. "Mary?" A face appeared above him. It wasn't Mary. It was Dr. Evans, looking more tired and disheveled than Arthur had ever seen him. The young doctor's eyes were wide with disbelief. "Mr. Pendleton?" Evans asked, his voice hushed. "Can you hear me?" Arthur nodded weakly. "Am I dead?" "No, Arthur," Evans said, shaking his head as if he still couldn't process the data on his clipboard. "No, you are very much alive, though medically speaking you shouldn't be." Arthur blinked, memories of the snow, the cold, and the fur flooding back to him. "The boy," Arthur rasped. "Where is the boy?" "The boy?" Evans frowned. "You mean Sheriff Miller?" "The lion," Arthur whispered. "King. Is he safe?" Dr. Evans sighed, pulling a chair close to the bed. "Arthur, you were found in a blizzard. Your body temperature had dropped to levels that usually cause immediate cardiac arrest. But here's the strange part. The frostbite on your hands and face is minimal, and your core temperature, when they brought you in, your chest and torso were significantly warmer than your extremities. It's the only reason your heart kept beating." The doctor leaned in closer. "The paramedics said, they said the thermal imaging showed a massive heat signature right on top of you before they arrived. Arthur, that animal, that lion, didn't just sit with you. He acted as a living incubator. He used his body heat to keep your vital organs functioning while he froze. He saved your life." Tears welled in Arthur's eyes. "Where is he? Did they shoot him? Tell me, Evans." "He's gone, Arthur," the doctor said gently. "Sheriff Miller said the moment the ambulance left, the lion walked into the woods. They've had drones up for 3 days, helicopters with infrared cameras. They've combed every inch of that forest." Arthur's heart sank. "And?" "Nothing," Evans said. "No tracks, no scat, no sightings. It's like he vanished into thin air. The zoo in the next county did a head count. They aren't missing any lions. No private sanctuaries are missing any animals. Nobody knows where he came from, and nobody knows where he went." Arthur closed his eyes, a small, knowing smile touching his lips. He knew. It took 3 weeks for the snow to fully melt from the valley of Oakhaven. It took another 2 weeks for Dr. Evans to sign Arthur's discharge papers. But the man who walked out of the county hospital wasn't the same man who had walked into the storm a month earlier. Arthur Pendleton stood straighter. The gray pallor of grief that had haunted his face for 7 years was gone, replaced by a ruddy, healthy glow. His heart, once fluttering and weak, beat with a steady, rhythmic strength that baffled the medical staff. The town had changed too. When Arthur walked down Main Street, people didn't look away. They stopped. They shook his hand. Children pointed and whispered, "That's him! That's the Lion Man!" He was no longer the crazy widower. He was a living legend, the protagonist of a miracle that no one could explain, but everyone wanted to believe in. But Arthur didn't care about the fame. He didn't care about the interviews he politely declined. He had one destination. The iron gates of the cemetery were open, bathed in the soft golden light of early spring. The air smelled of thawing earth and new grass. Arthur didn't need his cane as much today. He walked with purpose, his boots crunching softly on the gravel path. As he approached the north corner, his breath hitched. He half expected to see the golden shape waiting for him. He scanned the tree line, the shadows of the willows, looking for that flash of amber eyes. But there was only stillness. The birds were singing, oblivious to the drama that had unfolded on this very spot. Arthur reached Mary's grave. The snow was gone. The marble headstone, usually cold and gray, felt warm in the sun. He reached out and touched the engraved letters of her name, tracing the curves, just as he had traced the scars on the lion's face. "I'm back, Mary," he whispered, his voice steady. "And I think you know why I'm still here."
He looked down at the earth covering his wife, and then he saw it. Lying exactly in the center of the grave, in the exact spot where the lion used to rest his heavy head, was a single flower. But it wasn't a flower from the florist in town. It wasn't a plastic bouquet left by a well-meaning neighbor. It was a king protea. Arthur recognized it from the encyclopedias he used to read. It was a massive crown-shaped flower with petals like jagged spikes of pink and cream. It was a flower native to the harsh plains of South Africa. It didn't grow in Pennsylvania. It couldn't grow in Pennsylvania, certainly not in soil that had been frozen solid just days ago. There were no footprints around it, no tire tracks. It sat there, pristine and impossible, vibrating with color against the brown earth. Arthur fell to his knees, not in pain, but in reverence. He picked up the heavy flower. The stem was thick, the petals waxy and strong. It was real. Tears streamed down Arthur's face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of pure, unadulterated joy. He realized then that the lion hadn't just been an animal. The skeptics could say it was an escaped zoo creature. The police could file it as an unresolved wildlife incident. But Arthur knew the truth. The universe is vast, and love is a force that transcends biology, geography, and even death. When Arthur was ready to give up, when his heart was ready to stop, help had been sent. A guardian clothed in fur and muscle, carrying the heat of the sun in a winter storm. "Thank you," Arthur whispered, looking up at the blue sky. "Thank you for sending him." Arthur stood up. He placed the flower back on the grave, a beacon of color in the quiet cemetery. He buttoned his coat, turned around, and began the long walk back to his home. He wasn't walking toward an empty house anymore. He was walking toward a second chance. As he reached the gates, a sudden gust of wind blew through the valley. It rustled the trees, creating a sound that echoed off the canyon walls. To anyone else, it was just the wind, but to Arthur, it sounded exactly like a low, deep, affectionate rumble, a purr. He smiled, tipped his hat to the invisible presence, and kept walking. Arthur Pendleton was 85 years old, but his life was just beginning. They say that animals have a sixth sense, that they can see things we cannot, but perhaps they are simply messengers, reminding us that we are never truly alone. Arthur's story is a reminder that even in our darkest, coldest winters, help can arrive in the most unexpected forms. What do you think really happened that winter? Was King just a lost lion, or was he something more? Have you ever felt a pet or an animal protecting you in a way that felt spiritual? I want to hear your story. Yes, you. Scroll down to the comments right now. Tell me about the animal that changed your life. I read every single comment because your stories are the heartbeat of this channel. And if Arthur's journey touched your soul today, please do me a small favor. Click that like button. It helps these stories reach more lonely hearts that need hope. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Keep your eyes open. Your miracle might be just around the corner.